Ladies and gentlemen, we are all set to begin the webinar. Dr. Salim, do we have with us? All right, perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Walid Yawar, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of IPRI's Distinguished Lecture Series. The title for today's lecture is Climate Change Going to Drive National Security? A question that speaks to the interlinked effect that both variables will have on governance and interstate relations going forward, especially in a region among the most threatened by climate change with a long-standing history of conflict. To this end, we are pleased to have with us Dr. Salim Ali, and I'd like to briefly introduce him to our audience. Dr. Salim Ali joined the University of Delaware as a Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and Environment in September 2016. He has previously served as the chair in Sustainable Resource Development and an affiliate professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy at the University of Queensland, Australia. He has also served as a professor of environmental studies at the University of Vermont's Rubinstein School of Natural Resources and is a founding director of the Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security. Dr. Salim is also a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel and a climate change mitigation advisor at the Global Environmental Facility at the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. Among his various research undertakings, he serves as a senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Development, housed at the Columbia University in New York, and a senior fellow at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Salim, it is indeed an honor to have you with us for this edition of IPRI's lecture series, and we look forward to your remarks and your lecture. But before I hand over the floor to you, I would request Acting President Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua for his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Walid. I welcome Dr. Salim for his distinguished lecture talk, and I'm sure after this talk we'll be much wiser on a subject which is of great importance to us and humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change and its concomitant natural disasters pose a clear and present danger to security of mankind in the present era of hyper-utilization of natural resources and the unbridled pursuit of industrial development. The developed industrialized haves, having appropriated the fruits of development, are not ready to render a human service to the environment through carbon sacrifice, despite offering anodyne sops to the agitated global community of environment conservationists. China, India, and several East Asian nations view climate control efforts through carbon emission caps as attempts by the developed North to stymie the growth of industrial aspirants. The devastating impact of global warming has already propped a lot of problems, and there are movies galore which tell us that the human existence is at peril. A foretaste of the devastation wrought in natural disasters induced by climate change was experienced by the strongest and the richest country in the world in 2005 in the shape of Hurricane Katrina. The natural disaster destroyed most of New Orleans, causing a loss of $80 billion, killing 1,800 people and displacing 270,000 others. The American populace watched the scenes of devastation and the wrath of nature in bewilderment as more than 72,000 troops grappled with the rescue and rehab operation in what looked like a grisly scene. Now, after the harrowing experience of the climate disasters, the US National Security Establishment woke up to the sobering realization of securitizing the climate-induced natural disasters. According to Joshua B. Busby, the US National Security Strategy directed the DoD in 2006 to plan for deadly pandemics and other natural disasters that could produce WMD-like effects. Climate change and ensuing natural disasters threaten national cohesion and stability of densely populated nations with internal politico-economic cleavages such as Indonesia and Bangladesh, In Indonesia, the weak handling of the situation after 2004's tsunami that devastated Aceh fueled anti-government feelings, resulting in the destabilization of the region. In Bangladesh, the tardy disaster relief response by West Pakistan fueled separatism. Presently, 46% of the Bangladesh population lives in low elevation areas near the sea, with many living in settlements less than 5 meters above the sea level. With a population of 12.6 million, Dhaka is one of the most vulnerable cities where tsunami could cause millions of deaths and send many people into exile. Most of the sub-Saharan countries such as Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Darfur region of Sudan are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. In these areas, the government's capacity to tackle climate-induced famines, droughts, disease, and floods is extremely limited. Pakistan also is confronted today with some of the serious climate change threats due to global warming, changes in the ocean current patterns, delayed monsoons, floods, heat waves, and lately droughts. The impact of these factors on human security, especially food security, makes climate change one of the most potent threats to our national security. With one of the most rapidly increasing populations in the world, India and Pakistan both are making heavy demands on the already dwindling freshwater resources in the subcontinent. The possibilities of water wars as a result of upper riparians, that is India's water iced, presents a frightening scenario to one of the most heavily nuclear armed regions of the world. It is time both countries took stock of their real threats and stopped tilting at the windmills of self-manufactured political threats. Now, let us take a stock of the threats of climate change confronting us and our current response. Pakistan is confronted with threats such as flash floods, glacial lakes, outbursts, and famines, especially in Thar and Balochistan. Droughts, freakish rainfall, heat waves, and rising sea levels are also prevalent in the country. These natural phenomena are being facilitated by man-made assaults on the environment. Massive deforestation and mangrove destruction is causing soil erosion of the coastal ecosystem. Our mangrove forest cover, the first line of defense against sea intrusion, was 400,000 hectares in 1945 and has shrunk to 70,000 hectares, exposing our coast to sea intrusion and soil erosion. Now, Port Qasim's coal-based energy projects have displaced a sizable segment of our coastal population and destroyed valuable mangroves, rendering our coastline vulnerable to floods and tsunamis. An IMF study also shows that Pakistan is one of the third most water-stressed countries in the world, with a per capita water availability of 1,017 cubic meters. Now, far from being water abundant, we are now water stressed, which is a sorry saga, and we need to do a lot on that. And the role of international community and regional cooperation is also of great importance in this endeavor. Now, with these few words, I would like Dr. Salim to enlighten us of the looming threat of climate, disasters which are staring us in the face, both at international level and at regional level. So over to you, Waleed, for inviting Dr. Salim for his talk.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point and at the onset of Dr. Salim's lecture, I'd like to remind you to please keep sending me your questions through the course of the lecture, not necessarily at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of today's lecture, as the Acting President Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua mentioned, is to identify effects of climate change on national security. And with that context, I would request and invite Dr. Salim Ali for his lecture. Sir, please let me know when you want me to start the screen sharing option.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes, yep. Thank you very much, Brigadier Saab, for your very comprehensive introduction to the context of today's topic for Pakistan. And as a Pakistani by origin, of course, I am deeply committed to trying to help our country, even though I live abroad. And in this regard, what I've tried to do is to provide an international perspective first, and then I'll try to zoom into some of the specific areas in which national security policy could be informed by the global conversation. So this is just to give you, those of you who are in social media, I know your director, Hussain, Dr. Hussain is very involved in social media. So you're welcome to also follow conversations on Twitter later. So let's go ahead to the first slide. Okay, so this is a diagram which I prepared in some work I've been doing for the United Nations. I'm a member of the International Resource Panel, and we're currently undertaking a global assessment on the linkages between natural resources and migration. And one of the issues that comes up, of course, is the linkage between migration and conflict. So if you go back to sort of the core issues around how the climate security nexus comes about, human mobility is at the core of that, because what happens with climate change is that you're going to get some impact on livelihoods, and that's going to lead to displacement and conflict. So this diagram shows you essentially what that nexus is. And if you look at the left side, the green circle there, it says population growth. And on the right side, we have wealth distribution and economic development. So these are the two sort of push and pull factors that are leading to this challenge. And you can have this kind of dynamic, not just through resource scarcity, but you can also have it through, in some cases, resource abundance, because what happens is then where you have scarcity due to potentially climate change and other natural resource impacts, people are going to move towards areas where there's greater resource abundance. And this can be both domestic and it can be international. So in Europe, for example, one of the major conversations is that climate change is causing a lot of the land degradation in the sub-Saharan region, and that is leading to migration to Europe. We have seen unprecedented levels of migration flows to Europe from Central Africa, and a lot of that is being linked to land degradation, which in turn can be linked to climate change. Now, the other factor in this that's important is that climate change itself is not just a sufficient condition to lead to these kinds of conflict and security challenges. It can be an ingredient in a much more complex socio-ecological system. And that's important to keep in mind, because many of us who are social scientists who work with methods like regression, economists particularly, which tend to dominate the social sciences in Pakistan, they love to work with regressions. And regressions give you an air of authenticity. We tend to have a numerical bias in our education system, particularly in Pakistan, and economists who show large correlations with variables often get a lot of traction. So you get a lot of studies which are showing some kind of regression analysis linking climate change to conflict. Not yet, sorry. And so what I would like to urge you to consider is that there are many other factors which also play into it. So tribalism clearly is an important factor which can be accentuated by climate change as people move towards areas where there's resource availability. But the tribalism itself is also an important factor. So we have to keep in mind that this is one of many variables. Okay, now we can move on, Walid. Thank you. Now, this is from a paper in 2018, just to give you a sense globally of the studies which have been done on the linkage between climate and conflict. There are numerous studies over the past 2 decades that have been conducted in peer-reviewed journals. This is a compendium of all those studies, which was prepared and published in the journal Nature Climate Change, which is a very prestigious journal. And it was looking at especially the sampling bias that happens in these kinds of studies. If you look at the number of mentions of climate and conflict in the left column, these are the countries which show up the most in terms of the linkages between climate and conflict and security. And you've got, a lot of countries in Africa, but you also have the Middle East. Syria is noted, and Israel, Palestine are noted as well. And then on the right side, you have another metric of looking at where there has been linkage between climate and conflict in the literature and the number of battle-related deaths. And there, sadly, Rwanda comes up number one in terms of the genocide, of course, that happened in the 1990s. And there has been linkage to climate change with regard to that as well. And I've spent time in Rwanda. I've done field work there myself. It's a highly dense country in terms of population. And there has been a theory of change that suggests that some of the reasons why there was greater alienation and that level of flashpoint that happened at the time of the genocide could be linked to some of the concerns around land degradation that happened and how livelihoods were disrupted, which then accentuated tribalism between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and that led to the and that was again accentuated by many other factors. Media played an extremely important role in the Rwandan genocide. We cannot forget the role of Radio Rwanda in terms of sparking hatred between neighbors and so on. So it's not a simple connection, but it's one which has been made in the literature. Then you have, some of these other countries. Pakistan is not in this list in terms of the top 10 in the literature. India is. Some of the literature on India and climate security issues is domestic. It's much more about the kinds of concerns we have seen recently with the farmer riots in India. And those are domestic issues, not necessarily international ones, but they can have international spillover effects. Okay, next slide, please, Walid. Now, the authors of this study, what they then did, this was work carried out at the University of Melbourne by some friends and colleagues there. They also looked at the climate risk index, which is an index of vulnerability of countries to climate change. And this is what Brigadier Janjua was referring to when he said that Pakistan is ranked among the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. Now, in the extreme right-hand column, you have the listing of countries with reference to the climate risk index. And here you see Pakistan is in this categorization. Now, what they're trying to show is that a lot of times the literature can miss those areas which are important. So again, you have the countries on the left are the ones which have the greatest number of mentions. The middle column, they have adjusted and made it also sensitive to those countries which have the most exposure to climate change. So here you get a lot of countries which are small island states and with large coastal economies. So Kiribati, it's pronounced Kiribati even though it's written as Kiribati, which is a country in the Pacific, the Central Pacific. Tuvalu, which is another country which has in fact, they have already prepared for climate change to the level that they have bought land in another country, Fiji, to relocate their entire population because the sea level is rising so fast that within 50 to 100 years, the country will be uninhabitable. So the people of Tuvalu fortunately was able to make a lot of money from an unlikely source. And that was because when the internet web domains were being given out, the web domain for .tv was allocated to Tuvalu. And they sold the .tv domain names and created a trust fund. So they're a small country with a lot of money, surprisingly, because of that trust fund. And they've bought this land to move their people to Fiji eventually. Marshall Islands, which is another island country, Coral Atoll in the Pacific. Seychelles, which is also in the Indian Ocean, a country which is going to be very vulnerable. And then in the Middle East, Oman is notable because of its coastal economy. So those are the countries which have been adjusted accordingly. But Pakistan, even though it doesn't show up in the literature as much, what that shows us is that we need more research done that's one of the reasons I wanted to share this, is that we need more scholars in Pakistan to look at this aspect, because it is somewhat understudied in terms of the climate security nexus. Okay, next one, please, Walid. Now, this is a very recent paper which has been conducted by some colleagues at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, and this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, again, a very prestigious journal. And what they looked at was, they tried to unpack this issue of multiple causality that I was referring to, that you cannot just say climate change is going to lead to a security problem. There are many other confounding variables. And the role of social sciences is to deal with that complexity. So what they tried to do in this paper was to look at climate change as a threat multiplier. And this is a term which the US Department of Defense has used to describe climate change. Rather than saying that climate change causes conflict and security issues directly, they say that there can be existing threats and it can lead to a multiplication of those threats and lead to those challenges. So what they looked at was, and it's a very detailed quantitative study, those of you who are interested in reviewing it, they looked at it from the framework of opportunity costs, which is an economics way to think about what do you have to lose when you are making decisions. And what we find is that many times climate change becomes a much more likely cause of security challenges when people have very little to lose, so to speak. And you have that, what leads to that is income distribution. And what can also compound that particularly is food availability. And rainfall distribution is, of course, linked to food availability. So that is going to be the core aspect that we need to focus on, especially in Pakistan. In terms of food scarcity and the level of rainfall impact on food availability, that's going to be the most direct linkage to climate change as a threat multiplier when dealing with national security issues. So I would submit to you that the government should play a greater level of attention to that issue, as that's likely to be the area based on the research which is going to cause the most conflict likelihood moving forward. All right, next slide, Walid. Now, another area which is gaining a lot of attention, and this is not as relevant to Pakistan, but perhaps it may well be later as we partner with many other countries, and especially as we have a large diaspora of Pakistanis who are immigrating to Canada, and many of them are being given incentives to migrate to northern Canada. And that is that the melting of the Arctic is going to lead to new security challenges and opportunities. Because before, the Arctic was not navigable. And now that the Arctic is navigable in summers, we have opened the Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage for navigation. So you can see what that means in terms of access for maritime routes. I edited a book some years ago with one of my former PhD students, Rebecca Pincus, who is now a professor at the US Naval War College. And that book was titled Diplomacy on Ice, and published by Yale University Press. And we actually we got a series of scholars together from all over the world who contributed to looking at how this whole region in the Arctic, because of climate change, could be a place where new kind of diplomacy could be created. Currently, we have a governance mechanism there called the Arctic Council, which is not it's not a union of countries or anything like that. It is basically a platform for negotiations. And you have countries in this region which are not great friends currently. You know, we have Alaska and the US, of course, bordering very close to Russia in the Bering Strait, and a history of difficult relations, even though Alaska was bought from Russia by the US, interestingly enough. Right now, the relationship is quite difficult. You have Canada and Greenland, which is Greenland is technically a part of Denmark in terms of foreign policy, but it has been increasingly asking for independence. You have, of course, the European countries of Scandinavia. So this is going to be a fascinating area to consider what happens. And now China has said that they want to be considered an Arctic power. And the largest embassy in Iceland of any country in the world is the Chinese embassy, which is fascinating for me, having visited Iceland as well. So you have this geopolitics that's happening because of climate change. And I think Pakistan could get involved in this partly because of our positive relationship with China, but also, as I said, because of the diaspora. So it is one to keep an eye on in terms of what happens. The other thing is that the maritime route, if you look at this smaller map, uh, the shortest distance to travel from China to Germany now is going to be through the Northwest Passage, rather than going around from this usual Suez Canal route that we were used to. So we are going to see a major change in the whole maritime geopolitics moving forward from our region as well. All right, next one, please. Now to finish off, just to give you a few points on Pakistan's national security. This is just to give you a sense. One way to get this on the radar of the security establishment is, of course, the loss of life that has been linked to climate change. So you've got, this is from one of these journalistic articles that was written by a journalist, Muin Khan, I believe his name is, and the data comes from the South Asia Terrorism Portal. But just in 2019, if you compare the number of fatalities from monsoons and extreme climate events to terrorism, you see the difference there. And thankfully now the terrorism fatalities are going down in Pakistan. Become even more stark. Sadly, the climate related fatalities are likely to keep going up. Now, of course, we cannot link one specific climate event to global climate change, but in aggregate, you can make a case that the probability is definitely going to be increasing. And we need to, that's one of the reasons why the security establishment has to pay attention to. And I was very heartened by Brigadier Janjua's comments that the army is already thinking about these issues. Okay, next slide, please. Now, water, of course, is the area where we tend to get the most attention in Pakistan with regard to climate change because of our neighbor. Now, this is the data which is from a report some years ago, which I did for the Asia Society, and it gives us this very important metric called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is a measure of what percentage of water within a country comes from outside its borders. Now, if you look at the dependency ratio for Pakistan, it's 77%, which is quite a scary number. It's scary because it is showing that we are dependent on 77% of our water coming from outside our borders, a very large part of that coming from our neighbor to the east, India, but also dependent to some degree on Afghanistan and to some marginal degree China. So what we have here then is clearly a dynamic whereby if water availability is going to change as a result of rainfall patterns changing, and we have dependence from outside our borders, then we have to be even more concerned. So you have other countries like Bangladesh is even more in a stark situation because they have 91% of their water coming from outside, and a lot of it from China, from the Brahmaputra, and also from India, from the Ganges. So we are not alone in this. And what I would submit is that this is a potential area where Pakistan and Bangladesh should collaborate and cooperate about thinking around climate change and the dependency ratio issue, because this could be a way by which Bangladesh and Pakistan can have a joint negotiation strategy to deal with both India and China. Pakistan has better relations with China, and Bangladesh has better relations with India. And maybe there is an opportunity for some hydro diplomacy around this issue. So I would submit to you that our security establishment may see this as a good win-win prospect. Now, you may find, just for those of you who are interested, countries like Indonesia are zero because Indonesia is largely comprised of archipelago. It's an archipelago of islands, and islands have zero dependency ratio because all the water comes essentially from within their borders. You also have some weird situations like Kyrgyzstan, which has a negative external renewable resource, which means that it is essentially sending out water more than coming in, and so it is it's presented as external in that way, and in some cases because of shared lakes and all. So that's just to give you some perspective on how the numbers come about. Next slide. So with hydropolitics in Pakistan, the water availability, this is another troubling graph, because the water availability in Pakistan and in India both has been going down dramatically. And this is data from various government sources that was compiled by the Germans and the German news agency Deutsche Welle, which did a special on hydropolitics in South Asia last year. So here you've got Pakistan and India both. If you go back to 1951, the per capita water availability was very high, actually. It was pretty good. Now, a lot of that is because our populations have gone up so dramatically. And that is another question from an environmental policy perspective, a very difficult one, around how we manage our demographic trends. It's fine to have population increase if you can have what we call the demographic dividend, where you can actually find employment and productive use for your population, which is what China did. Unfortunately, South Asian countries have not been able to harness their demographic dividend as well as one would have hoped. And so then the population becomes a liability rather than an asset. So that leads to even greater stress. So here we've got a situation now, though, in 2015, when the last time this kind of analysis was done, we've got a dramatic decline in water availability per capita. And by 2025, it's going even further down. And what is troubling is that it's going much faster down for Pakistan than it is for India. Our water availability per capita in 2025 will go down to 860, and India's will be at 1341. That is again partly because our population growth is much higher than India. We have the highest population growth rate in South Asia, except for Afghanistan, which has a higher population growth rate. So these are all interlinked factors which we have to think about. So climate change is eroding the national resilience to deal with water stress. That is the fundamental challenge which we have to consider. Next slide, Walid. So finally, the ways to handle this is the last slide, and then we'll open it up for discussion. The national policy response to climate security can happen in three concrete ways. One is we, first of all, need to internalize climate change planning within the national defense and security establishment. I'm not sure if that has been done in Pakistan. I would like to feel that it has. I mean, from what I heard from Brigadier Janjua, at least the conversations are happening. I'm not sure how formal it is in terms of actually having a particular assigned unit. In the Pentagon, there is a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Environment and Natural Resources, which is a very high-level position within the Pentagon that deals with climate change and other natural resource issues. And many other countries are doing the same. So that's an institutional response. Second is around early warning systems for climate emergencies, similar to national security emergencies. This has to be done at a regional level. At one time, SARC was playing that role. We have had conversations during the COVID pandemic. Sadly, they got politicized and fell apart, but at least they started to have an early warning system around pandemics during the crisis that emerged. Similarly, we could have that conversation, whether it happens through SARC, if SARC can be revitalized. It has been on life support, sadly, but maybe there is a way to revitalize the organization. But there could be other ways. But this has to be done regionally. It cannot be done just locally. So that's something which should be considered, and there could be a much better early warning system around what would happen in terms of changes due to extreme weather events or droughts, long-term changes that are happening as well. And then finally, there is this way in which we call the green helmets, where soldiers and the military established can be involved in environmental restoration. In Pakistan, we have a major land degradation problem, which has been accentuated by climate change in terms of land loss due to salinity, waterlogging. The military, we have a very large military force, which is one of the largest contributors of blue helmets to the United Nations system, peacekeeping forces all over the world. We could have green helmets, similarly, where the military is involved in environmental activities. In the US, we have had the US Army Corps of Engineers, which did work on engineering projects that had sometimes environmental implications historically, but many times were terribly misguided, and they actually messed up a lot of the infrastructure. In Florida, for example, they made canals, they straightened rivers to make them the water flow faster, and essentially destroyed part of the Everglades ecosystem. And now they have spent a lot of money to unstraighten the canals so that they can actually have a proper water system. So the engineers, much as we love engineers for all the good work they do, if they are not ecologically minded, they can actually make things worse. So what is important is the environmental planners need to work in concert with the engineers in a more ecologically conscious way. And then that can hopefully help. That can be one way in which you have the green helmets involved, but it can also be more the work of rangers in parks to do restoration, management of resources. Of course, our army does a wonderful job in terms of the mountainous areas, doing a lot of important work there in terms of providing access. But there are also impacts of the security establishment's presence, because you get, of course, a lot of material which goes with the infrastructure. So I think having those three areas in which the national security establishment can get more directly involved would be a good way forward. So I'll end there, and I would welcome discussion and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salim, for your lecture. We do have questions coming in, and we'll directly move to the first one, which has been asked by Mr. Adil Mukhtar, who's a researcher here at IPRI, and he wants to know the background for his question. In fact, is that national and domestic institutions play a decisive role in climate change mitigation. Do Pakistan's institutions have requisite climate change awareness, and which countries can be taken as best examples in this regard?
I think that the climate change awareness has been percolating in Pakistan quite well. We have a strong environmental civil society. The World Wildlife Fund office in Pakistan has a long distinguished history. We also have, unusually for many developing countries, the business community has been very involved in environmental activities, particularly Sayyid Babar Ali and Packages Limited. He was the founder of WWF Pakistan, which is highly unusual for a business executive to start an environmental organization, especially one of an NGO that is a conservation organization, not just, there are some which are more just enabling institutions for business. So I think we have a pretty good educational platform opportunity. In terms of the real challenge with any of these efforts is how do you raise climate change from low politics to high politics? And that is a challenge. I mean, in Pakistan, the Ministry of Environment or Climate Change, it hasn't often had the same level of influence as the Defense Ministry or the Finance Ministry. And so I think that is the key. We need to empower, it needs to be something that is across the government, and it's an environmental ethic which permeates across the government. Other countries which have done that, you would consider a lot of the usual players in the OECD, which have been thinking about this, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and they have issued many guidelines on this. In terms of developing countries, the ones which are particularly admirable, I would say. One which I mentioned, Rwanda actually has done quite a lot to improve its environmental performance. Malaysia, if you look at the Environmental Performance Index, which is a measure of the performance of countries using a range of variables that the World Economic Forum and Yale University produce, Malaysia ranks very highly in that. They have had a pretty good track record. Until recently, unfortunately, last 5 years have been very bad for this country. Brazil was doing very well, but then in the last 5 years, we have had a change in government in Brazil. Well, there was a lot of corruption problems and so on. And having worked in Brazil, it's been very sad to see how things have gone the other way, where the government has lost a lot of its commitment. But it was doing very well until around 2015. So those are some examples.
Thank you, Doctor. The next question that we have is from Ambassador Asif Durrani, who's a senior research fellow here at IPRI. He asks, can Pakistan improve its water stress status by better water management systems, such as building more dams? But dams, in fact, are considered to be harmful for climate. Your comments on this, please.
Yes, a very good question. What matters is the scale of the dam. And how you look at the climate change impacts of hydropower relates to the scale at which the dam is built, because you need a lot of physical infrastructure to build the dam, and the carbon footprint of using a lot of concrete is a very carbon intensive material. And if you're going to use an enormous amount of concrete to build a very large dam, then that goes into the calculation of the carbon footprint of the dam. And then you have to look at the life of the dam. So if you build a very large dam and it's not going to have a very long life, then that carbon accounting doesn't come out very favorably. However, small scale hydro is excellent. Small scale hydro, run of the river hydro, where you are not having to put too much concrete. Those are great opportunities for Pakistan. But building very large infrastructure dams, that has major challenges, especially in a country which is so densely populated. You have also concerns around resettlement and relocation, huge social challenges. We have seen that has been one of the reasons the Kalabagh Dam and others have had challenges too. And then you have, of course, jurisdictional conflicts as well. So hydropower should be considered. I think hydropower is an important option, but I would say qualitatively look at the kind of hydropower. Small scale hydro particularly, and run of the river hydro. The very large hydro, we need to be very vigilant about in terms of the carbon accounting.
Thank you, sir. So the next question that we have, and I'll come back to Mr. Adil Mukhtar, who is a researcher here and who has worked ardently on climate change. And this is a question or a concern rather, that has been raised by multiple experts, including yourself, by the acting president in his opening speech, with regards to interstate relations between India and Pakistan, and how climate change plays into those interstate relations, or in fact, how it plays into conflict between the two countries. Now, the region, as you've mentioned, is most vulnerable, or one of the more vulnerable regions to the perils of climate change. Yet we do see conflict persisting on sharing of perhaps the most basic resource, that is water. Can you, or do you believe that climate diplomacy can trump the state of interstate relations or interstate conflict between Pakistan and India? And if so, how can that be achieved?
Yes, I think it is possible to convert a divisive, competitive approach to water to one which is cooperative. The Indus Waters Treaty was never an environmental treaty. This is often mistaken. People present it as an example of how adversaries could cooperate over water. It was a divisive treaty, which essentially used the World Bank as a mechanism to divide rivers between the two countries. It was not framed as an environmental cooperative treaty where you say, let's manage the Indus River basins as a cooperative system, as an ecological system. So one way to do it would be to think about the Indus Waters Treaty being renegotiated at some point so that it is considered more in terms of an integrated ecological mechanism for managing the riparian basin. Whether that is possible in the short term, I am a realist in terms of pragmatically thinking about all the level of distrust we have. It will require some level of international engagement. Both countries have been resistant to having any kind of mediation, apart from the World Bank's role, which is within the treaty. But the way forward is maybe using the UN Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement to think about how both countries can better cooperate in terms of meeting their targets, what we call the nationally determined contributions for climate mitigation. And it is possible that there could be some greater cooperation between the two countries. There was a time when the British government had supported a network called CDKN, the Climate Development Knowledge Network. And Pakistan was the base for South Asia for that network. It was managed by an NGO called Lead Pakistan. It played a good role in terms of there was conversation, at least at the level of civil society groups between India and Pakistan also around, but it was difficult because of the political conflict. So I think there is an opportunity, but it requires leadership. It requires leadership from both sides in the security establishment to say, well, this is an issue which is bigger than ourselves. It's a global issue. We are thinking about our future generations. And then you can lift it from low politics to high politics. I think if people start to think about that collectively, that there are these win-win opportunities, it's possible. We also have, in terms of other international treaties, like the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, we could have cooperation on that in the Indus Delta between India and Pakistan. Both countries are signatories to the Wetlands Agreement, and Pakistan actually has a Ramsar wetland site in the Indus Delta. India could have that opportunity. I have even suggested in an article I wrote for the Stimson Center a couple of years ago that the dispute we have between India and Pakistan in the Sir Creek region, it could potentially be resolved through the Ramsar Convention, because both countries are signatories to the convention. And this would be a very neutral way of handling it. It would say, look, we're not losing face. We are doing this because we are both signatories to an international treaty. So there are ways. It requires leadership, it requires creative thinking, but it's possible. I have seen that happen in many countries. We've seen it between Eritrea and Ethiopia. They have had a terrible border conflict for years. It just took leadership to resolve some of those issues. I've seen it with environmental peace building between Ecuador and Peru, which had a terrible territorial conflict going back 150 years. And they were able to come to agreement because of a very important environmental area in the Cordillera del Condor, they call it, between the two countries. And with some mediation from the US and Brazil during the Clinton administration, they reached a peace agreement and they made that into a conservation zone. So there are ways, and imaginatively we can find ways, but it requires leadership. There have been many proposals on the Siachen Glacier, on the Peace Park proposal, which I was involved in. We had members of the military who were involved in that. Sandia National Labs in the US brought brigadiers from Pakistan and India together. They came up with a peace plan on how that could be resolved. Sadly, it fell apart for various reasons. There's plenty of blame to go around. I won't point fingers. So it requires leadership. A lot of the work, even the nitty gritty, has been done, but it requires the leadership to move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. And you've mentioned at length various avenues that can diffuse conflict between India and Pakistan. But there's another question. In fact, there are two questions. I'll pull them together, which would want to know if water conflict can escalate into wars between India and Pakistan, if a possibility that India does block flow of water to Pakistan. In such a scenario, or in other scenarios tending to water conflict, is war a possibility between the two countries?
Well, the research on water conflicts suggests that water can lead countries very much to the brink of war, but it very rarely actually leads to war. So, and the reason is because it becomes such a human rights issue that eventually countries back off. So what I would say, the same is happening currently between Egypt and Ethiopia right now on the Nile. You know, Ethiopia is building a dam on the Nile, and Egypt has for years said that they will bomb Ethiopia if they do it. And there's been, you know, all kinds of saber rattling about it. But so far, they have been negotiating. Just last week, the African Union tried another effort to negotiate. It hasn't yet resolved the problem. But I would not say that if Egypt is going to bomb Ethiopia. It's very unlikely. It will eventually lead them to some kind of negotiated settlement. So that's what the data on water wars, so to speak, water wars suggests, is that they lead to tension, they lead countries to the brink of conflict, but they back off because they see the humanitarian element. I hope the same will happen with Pakistan and India, that at some point it will lead to a convergence of finding a negotiated outcome. You know, clearly the upper riparian has greater strength in some of the negotiations. But, you know, we have to also think about other sources of water for ourselves. We have to think about conservation. We lose a lot of water. We shouldn't just be looking at it from the point of view of how do we solve the problem with the upper riparian. The level of water loss in urban infrastructure in Pakistan is astounding, just loss from pipes and bad infrastructure. So let's try to focus on the conservation side while we try our best on the other side too. And we could actually do very well with that. We could think about rain harvesting systems. All homes should have cisterns on their roofs. So we are harvesting our rainwater and storing it. We don't have that. Most homes don't. We should be thinking about also how we use our groundwater. We have unfortunately ruined our aquifers. We have salinated our aquifers because of bad hydrological extraction processes from tube wells and whatnot. So let's think about also our own domestic resources and how we can manage them better.
Point well made, Dr. Salim. And I'll move on to the next question, which has been asked by Dr. Hussain Nadeem, the Executive Director here at IPRI. He would want to know that how much do you think climate communication can play a part in mitigating Pakistan's domestic climate related issues? And more importantly, how do you think we should go about it?
And the last part I missed, sorry, the connection cut off. Could you repeat?
He'd asked how climate communication can play a part in mitigating Pakistan's domestic climate related issues. And more importantly, how do you think we can go about achieving that?
Yes. So the climate communication, you know, it goes back to the earlier question about the role of civil society. I think that's very important. But one other additional area that I would suggest is that our curriculum, our educational curriculum, should have a required ecological literacy requirement. You know, Pakistan has instituted so many other kinds of requirements. We have Islamiyat requirement. Even within Islamic education, there's a broad literature on environmental ethics. We are a very worshipful country. And so why not use even Islamic education There was a time I was involved in promoting environmental education in madrasas in Pakistan. And I found even that many of the madrasa leadership were saying, yes, this is something which, we have in Islamic scripture, that humans are the stewards of the land, and they should be responsible. And similarly, how we can manage climate change. There's a whole effort around Muslim scholars working on climate change, which was led by Morocco. So that's on the Islamic education side. I say that because I know pragmatically that in Pakistan, that is a very important venue for social change. But also the secular curriculum, we could have much more environmental science. I'm saddened, when I did my high school at Aitchison College in Lahore, and I took geography as a subject, which is not very popular in Pakistan. It's like, oh, the losers take geography, sadly. And geography is where you could get environmental studies. Now, I was a bit of a rebel, and I said, I don't care what other people think. I enjoy environmental science, and that's what I want to do. But a lot of my colleagues, they were like, Ji, bas doctor or engineer banna hai, and they were just not interested. So I hope that changes. I hope it's not that people with lower marks are the ones who go and do environmental science, environmental literacy. If it is permeated across the curriculum from secondary education onwards, people will build that sensibility.
Thank you, sir. And I agree with your point on that. Climate change is often, or does often, play second fiddle to more traditional security threats in our universities, curriculums, and other activities that have often been hosted. And that dissuades climate change from being addressed as at an alarming scale that it should be. I'll move on to the next question, which is again has been again asked by Dr. Hussain Adeem. He says that given that the current prime minister has taken an unprecedented stand globally and locally on environment, do you see that the government is headed in the right direction with the climate change policy and programs it is currently working on and has launched?
Yes, I was at the climate change meeting in my United Nations role in Madrid last year, and I met with the Minister Saab and the Pakistani delegation uh, on the sidelines. They have brought Pakistan at the forefront of the international agenda. They were given quite an opportunity to share Pakistan's experiences. That's very positive. I think there has been too much focus on the forestry aspect because I think that was a very important point that was made by the Prime Minister in terms of the tree tsunami. But I think we cannot couch the whole of the environmental activity within trees. Trees are important, but they're part of an ecological system which is more complex. And so I think the government needs to broaden its vision a little bit around that. But I commend them for at least raising the profile of Pakistan at the international stage with reference to the environment. And I've seen at the World Economic Forum also, they have made very positive strides and showcasing what Pakistan has done ecologically. So I salute them for that. But they need to think beyond trees.
Thank you, sir. So the next question we have is from Mr. Asad Bajwa, and this is related to the previous question that I've asked. He wants to know that since provinces are getting more autonomy under the 18th Amendment, will that affect national level initiatives that are being taken?
Yes. So, the environment defies borders. So first thing you have to always think about whenever you're making new borders, whether it's district borders or provincial borders, rivers are going to flow where they flow, groundwater is going to flow where it flows, birds are going to fly where they fly. They don't care about borders. Even when you build physical borders, I have been to the US-Mexico border, and they're building this enormous wall there. But eventually that wall goes into the Pacific Ocean, and they can't build a wall in the Pacific, and you see this really pitiful scene where the wall is just kind of going into the ocean, and the last part of the barriers are just being completely destroyed by the waves. So eventually human beings have to recognize that these delineations, they are important for some level of political governance, but that the environment is always going to transcend them. So you need to have communication between the jurisdictions. So if the provinces are going to have more autonomy on issues like education or other areas, well, that's fine. But when it comes to ecological issues, they will have to communicate with each other. Otherwise, both will suffer eventually. So I'm hoping that this kind of devolution keeps that in mind. And as long as there's good communication, there's a level of co-management, we should be okay.
True that. And with that, we move to the next question, sir, which has been asked by Mr. Osama Nizamani, another researcher here at IPRI. He asks about three essential thematic areas, in your opinion, that public administration at the district level should be mandated to work on in Pakistan to achieve climate resilience. So there's three essential thematic areas that distinctly Mr. Osama wants to know about.
He wants me to just come up with three areas of resilience. Okay. Yeah, no, sure. Just to enumerate what would be priorities, just um, off the cuff, I would say for, if you talk about resilience, you're talking, the term resilience implies that you are building a system which is able to bounce back if there is some kind of a shock. And what we may say, not just bounce back, but bounce forward, that you learn from the shock and you actually improve rather than just going back to where you came from. So the way in which to do that is, first of all, to make sure that we have a good way of doing the early warning, which is one of the points I put forward. So resilience comes from knowing what the risks are. So you have an early warning system to evaluate the risks. The second area where resilience is very important is diversification. In any kind of resilience literature you come across, people talk about, if you have a diversified economy, if you have a shock in one area, you can bounce back in another. Pakistan has had a reasonably diversified economy, but there are areas where we still have a lot of dependence. Historically with our exports, we'd had a lot of dependence on textiles. So if there are shocks because of climate change in one area, we have an impact on the cotton industry that could have impacts elsewhere. We are building that, again, credit to the current government by having a tourism strategy, for example. Tourism builds another opportunity for having a service sector, potentially, which can also diversify the economy beyond manufacturing. So that could be a second way, is diversification. And a third way that just off the cuff I might suggest is that we consider decoupling. This is a term that is used by the International Resource Panel that I serve on also, is that decoupling means that economic growth and environmental impact, if we are able to decouple them. So the impact usually when you have economic growth happening, you also have an increase in environmental impact. But if we can find a way by which we decouple environmental impact from economic growth, that should be the way forward for us to consider. How do you do that? Well, one way is efficiency. We figure out what are ways of efficiency to move forward. But efficiency itself is not enough, because sometimes efficiency can lead to what we call the rebound effect, which is that if you make things more efficient, you can still increase consumption of materials. And so that increased consumption can mean that you still have enough of an impact. So for example, if you make cars more efficient, they're more fuel efficient, people sometimes end up driving more. So the total impact stays the same. So we have to still be cautious about the total impact.
Right, sir. So for the next question, we move on to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a project, as you know, is considered significant itself for Pakistan's overall national security. Now, the second phase of CPEC, which Pakistan and China are all geared to begin with, is focused on industrialization and special economic zones. Do you think that a move towards or a transition towards industrialization would aggravate climate change in Pakistan? And if so, how do we balance the two in terms of policies?
Yes, I mean, CPEC originally, when it was conceived, was very carbon intensive. And that is why there was a lot of pushback from the environmental community. There was a major focus on coal. That has changed in the last 6 months. I have seen a major shift, even within the Pakistani government, saying that they do not want to focus on growth in coal power. So I think the Chinese are also realizing, because they have set a target. Premier Xi Jinping has said that by 2060, China will be net zero carbon, which is a very ambitious target, but I think they can meet it. So if they're trying to do that, they should try to help Pakistan also meet its net zero target by 2050 is what most countries would like. So I think CPEC has an opportunity for what we call green growth. The industrialization can be in more of a green growth format. You know, if we think about renewable energy infrastructure, China has enormous experience with that. There are opportunities in Balochistan, particularly, to have much more solar power. And we have large tracts of land also. We should think about using those kinds of technologies through CPEC more so. In terms of industries, the way in which, so the usual manufacturing industries, heavy manufacturing, designing those plants so that they're more ecologically efficient. I would suggest CPEC should have eco-industrial parks, which should be part of their mandate. I serve on the science panel for the Global Environment Facility, which you mentioned, the GEF, which is the world's largest multilateral trust fund for the environment. It basically services all the major environmental treaties. And as part of that, I review proposals from countries for GEF projects, and many of them have large public and private sector partnerships. I think the industries, if they work, for example, on GEF proposals for eco-industrial parks, which means that you have industries that are exchanging wastes with each other, they are co-located, so they are much more energy efficient. That could be a way by which CPEC can actually play a very positive role in green growth. But it will require some foresight. It requires greater upfront investment for longer term gains. And so let's hope that both our politicians as well as our friends in China are able to move that. China has a fantastic record of ecological planning in many areas. I've been all over China, and I've lectured in many Chinese universities, and I'm thoroughly impressed with what they have the ability to do. It's heartening that so many Pakistanis are now doing their PhDs in China, especially at the premier universities like Tsinghua and others, which are top of the line. I mean, they're as good or better than many American or European universities, but the higher level ones.
All right. Dr. Salim, the next question we have is in context of COVID-19. It has been asked by Gulshan, who's a researcher here at IPRI. She says that it is expected that extreme climate events would disturb socio-political dynamics of Pakistan's society. In this context, are environmental centric initiatives, would they become a priority for Pakistan's overall policy framework? Should they become a priority in Pakistan's overall framework, and what policies, legal or administrative changes measures are needed to fulfill such an objective?
Yes, well, I think it's important that we go beyond that view that the environment is um, a zero-sum game with jobs, basically saying that either you have jobs or the environment. We can have opportunities whereby the environment creates, being careful about environmental issues creates jobs. And I think if we think of these matters in those ways, then it will be much easier. When I was growing up in Pakistan, people would say to me, I would have conversations with senior people, sometimes in government, just casually at HSN, we had a lot of these dignitaries visiting and all, and people would say, बच्चे यहाँ लोग भूख से मर रहे हैं और तुम environment की बात कर रहे हो, which world are you living in? And they would be very dismissive of me in those terms. But I think increasingly now people realize कि भाई जो लोग भूख से मर रहे हैं वो इसलिए मर रहे हैं क्योंकि हमने अपने माहौल का ख्याल नहीं रखा. We have not been careful about using our natural resources effectively. So making the connection between poverty and the environment is very important, and educating our public around that is very important.
Indeed, Dr. Salim. And for the last question that we have, we'll move to the United States and the Green New Deal, which is a holistic political, social, and economic movement. Is it important to launch such projects? Is it important to finance such green projects increasingly? Or is it increasingly important to stop corporations from financing projects that are damaging the ecosystem in general?
Yes, so the Green New Deal, the challenge with it, so the idea of the Green New Deal, it goes back to the New Deal, which was another important moment in American history in terms of coming up with large amounts of public sector investment in business development. The challenge is, can we afford it when we have so many other competing priorities? So if we have, for example, healthcare is a very important priority. In the case of the US, we have a major problem in terms of providing affordable healthcare. So if the government is going to invest in one area, how much money can they have without increasing inflation and having a huge budget deficit and a much larger national debt? So that's the real problem. The idea of a Green New Deal, everyone supports. It's a matter of whether it can be financed effectively. And so I think we do need to make sure that we are fiscally responsible in terms of such a process. And I'm based in Delaware, where the incoming president Joe Biden is from Delaware. He's a graduate of our university, and as well as his wife. So I am very familiar with what the Biden administration's plans are, and they have a more pragmatic approach because they recognize that if we go too much in one direction and not prioritize a lot of these other issues, it can be a problem. Also, during the Obama administration, there were unfortunately some mistakes made in terms of green investment. There was a lot of money wasted in terms of solar power, for example. And that has led to some skepticism about how green industry is sold. So we have to be very measured about evaluating green investment, green entrepreneurs, what is actually doable and what is not. I think there are lots of opportunities, but it needs a measured approach.
Thank you, Dr. Salim, for such an enlightening discourse. It was indeed an honor listening to you. And with that, I'll revert to Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, acting president, for his remarks.
Thanks, Waleed. In the end, I would like to extend Islamabad Policy Research Institute's special thanks to Dr. Salim for a very enlightening discourse on a subject which is of life and death for a country like Pakistan. And some very important takeaways we have got, like the need for greater scholarship in climate and national security. I think that's an area in which we need to fill up a lot. And second, the need for to take recourse to international conventions on climate change, and which could resolve the conflicts between the two countries. So that's also an area, I think, in which greater attention needs to be paid. And the most important is the need for preservation of our resources, because water conservation and preservation is an important area identified by the learned speaker today. And at the end of the day, I think all these important takeaways that we have garnered through this discourse and very astute observations of Dr. Hali, I think it will go a long way in giving shape to our research thrust on climate change. And from here onwards, I think we've got some very important nuggets, and which in their own right should constitute new wave of climate change and mitigation of the threats research literature. So I once again thank you, sir, and I'm looking forward to many such future interactions with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brigadier Saab. Thank you to Dr. Hussain as well for his invitation to Dr. Hussain Nadeem, and thank you, Waleed. It's a pleasure always to reconnect with Pakistan and Pakistanis. My heart is still with my country.
You're welcome, sir. It was indeed an honor having you. And with that, we will close our session. We will close our lecture. I'd like to remind the participants to please stay tuned on our social media pages for all research publications. And with that, it's Allah Hafiz from the Islamic Policy Research Institute.
Okay.